Hi everyone, welcome to the next lesson for week 9. We will continue focusing on some grammar points and editing your first draft of your process analysis essay. In this PowerPoint, I intend to go a little bit faster than the last one. Please do have a pen or pencil, your book, as well as your draft next to you so that you are able to follow along with me with the assignments and make the edits as needed. Again, if you have questions specifically about the lesson, you can post them on Facebook. I discourage you from messaging me personally with those kind of questions. Your question could be that of someone else's as well. So we can, answer the question. We can answer the question at one time, basically. All right, so let's get started. This should be a quick review. Time clauses are pretty commonly used and quite obvious. So we're on page 45. Again, make sure you have a pen or pencil ready. And time clauses, why do we use them? Why do we use time clauses? So if you look with me on page 45, it says time clauses show the order of two events. So basically, we're talking again about logical sequence, logical order, whether it be chronological, in this case it is by time, or it could be by order of importance. So time, we're talking about chronological. And so this is pretty obvious that we start the phrase, the clause, phrase, clause, interchangeable. We start it with a subordinate, subordinating or subordinate conjunction. We have before, after, right after, any of those will work. As soon as, so the subordinating conjunction itself denotes time, okay? So you will notice that it looks very similar to a concept that we just talked about. So how are they similar to complex sentences? And they are complex sentences. That's why they're very similar, because they are. You have a dependent clause, which starts with a subordinating conjunction, such as after, before, soon as. And then you have your main clause or independent clause. So looking at the example, when the time clause comes before the main clause, it is followed by a comma. It's the same thing as a complex sentence. The first example says, after the turkey has been defrosted. Obviously, this has to be dependent, right? Can't stand on its own. It's an incomplete thought. Then we have the main clause or independent clause, take the plastic off. Okay? Before I put the turkey in the oven, I loosely fill the cavity. As soon as the turkey is golden brown, you should take it out of the oven. All right, so using these time clauses, we're emphasizing when it should be done. Now you can reverse this. Of course, you can put the main clause in the beginning, but sometimes when you're giving steps, you might want to put the dependent clause in the beginning of the sentence. So take the plastic off after the turkey has been defrosted. Well, in this case, it might be good to maybe state the main clause in the beginning. It just really depends. You don't want to do this for every single sentence. However, in some cases, you may need to emphasize the next step before the other. And then at the bottom, we have when the time clause comes after the main clause, omit the comma. Exactly the same rule as a complex. So why is this important? Well, because you guys have been writing a process analysis essay which focuses on logical order and sequence. So you should have used time clauses in your essay. If you haven't, that's a problem. It's kind of hard to avoid time clauses when you're talking about a process, especially a process that is a festival or a holiday. There has to be some kind of step. Now, this is not to say that I would mark you off if you didn't use any time clauses. I would say that it would be quite strange and you probably wouldn't get the best of grades, but I'm not going to sit there and mark you down for not using time clauses, but you really should. So if you have not, make a note of that on your draft and look to see have you used time clauses and have you used them correctly. So I'm not going to go through each and every example from the exercise. I think this is pretty obvious because we've done this last lesson. So very quickly, let's go to the bottom of page 45 and look at exercise 5. It says combine each pair of sentences to create a single sentence with a time clause and a main clause. The word in parentheses is the one that you should use. Of course, you can write the sentence in two different ways. Obviously, dependent in the beginning, main clause at the end, or vice versa. Number 1 is done for us, so let's go to number 2. It says buy a computer disk, make sure it is compatible with your computer. The word in parentheses is before. You may pause. Okay, so the answer could be before buying a computer disk, comma, make sure it is compatible with your computer. I did it so that it's in the third person, so I put the gerund form of buy, okay? You could also say before you buy a computer disk. Again, it depends on your audience. If it's academic, you would not want to use second person. You would need to use third person. So again, before buying a computer disk, make sure it is compatible with your computer. Okay, number 3 says format it. Use the computer disk. If you need to, you can pause now. Okay, so you can say before formatting it, use the new computer disk. Or use the new computer disk before formatting it. Okay, very good. I will have to say that this is quite dated. Nobody uses computer disks anymore. I don't think you guys know what a floppy disk is. I do. Okay, very quickly, the last one, number 4, we'll just do number 4. And if you'd like to do 5 and 6 on your own for extra practice, go for it. I encourage you to do that. Number 4 says, save your essay on a disk. Print it out. You can pause now. Okay, so you could have said, after saving your essay on a disk, comma, print it out. Or you could say, print it out after saving your essay on a disk. So you understand time clauses, complex sentences by now. Use them. So at this point, go ahead and have a look through your first draft to see, did you use time clauses? Did you use them correctly? And have you varied your sentence structure? Are you just using complex sentences that start with dependent clauses? If so, change it up. You can put the dependent clause at the end. We're now going to move on to the next language focus, and I think the last language focus that I'm going to present in this whole editing process. It is also the last for the unit, but I did add an extra, like mechanical and then spelling and so on and so forth. So this is the last language focus. You've heard of passive voice versus active voice. If you have not, well, that's a little odd, but if you have not, it is good to definitely get some extra practice. Like I said, you should have heard of passive and active voice, and I'm pretty sure your teachers and prior professors likely taught you that you should avoid using the passive voice as much as possible. Now, there's a reason why it exists. So obviously there are uses for passive voice, and we do need to use them sometimes. The reason why we're focusing on passive voice in this section is because passive voice is quite useful for a process analysis essay. And that's because we want to focus on the result or the process, so to speak. Sometimes you may not know the agent or the subject, and that is, or you don't want to give responsibility. And in that case, we use passive voice. Not to say that every sentence, okay, in your essay, excuse me, should be passive voice. It's just to say that it is okay for this type of essay. We expect you to use passive voice in this case because we need to, again, emphasize a result or process. And we will go over in more detail why we should use passive voice. Now, you may have heard me mention agent. Okay, don't get too confused. Follow along with me. So if you look at page 48, it says passives are formed with be, okay, the word be, and a past participle. Okay, so we all know what past participles are. It's not just the word in simple past like with ed, it's the actual participle, past participle of a verb. Then we also use by, the preposition by, plus the agent. And the agent is the person or thing that performs the action. Now, you could say that the agent is the subject. However, it's slightly different when we're talking about passive. In an active sentence, the subject is for sure clear, and it's just the subject. There is no agent in an active sentence. The subject usually is the one performing the action. Typically, it's the subject is at the beginning of the sentence. Typically, not always. It depends on your type of sentence, like a complex sentence, for example. But the subject should be clear to the reader no matter what. Now, in a passive form, we use what we call an agent, and that's because when we switch the subject and the object becomes the subject, and then the previous subject becomes the agent, and that's why we switch the terms. Follow along on page 48. Also, quickly to note that the only verbs that can be put into passive voice are transitive verbs. We talked about that briefly in class, transitive versus intransitive. A transitive verb is a type of verb that can be followed by an object. Intransitive, in, the prefix in means the opposite of, cannot. So it cannot be followed by a object. So keep that in mind, and we will go over that information. So as you can see, passive sentences change the order completely. The subject of the active sentence becomes the agent, and then the object becomes the subject. So let's look at the example. An active sentence, the folk dancers entertain the crowd. The subject is clear. It's the folk dancers. The verb is entertain. Who is entertained, or what is entertained? The crowd. It's transitive. The object is clear. It's followed by an object. Now, when we look at passive, notice that the object now is the subject. Okay, the crowd is entertained by the folk dancers. And notice what we've done. We've taken the form of be or to be, because to be is a verb. Is, are, was, were. Those are the conjugated forms of the verb to be. Okay, so this is what we mean by be. It doesn't mean that you would say the crowd be entertained. No, you have to still conjugate the verb. Unless you're using modals like must be, then it's different. But in this case, you need to conjugate the verb. So be plus the past participle of the verb entertain, in this case it's just simple ed, is entertained. We have the preposition by and plus the agent. The crowd is entertained by the folk dancers. Okay, it should be easy to flip sentences when you understand active versus passive. So let's look at simple present passive. Let's look at some of the examples at the bottom of the page. The kimono is worn by women in the summer. Okay, we should easily be able to flip that and make that sentence active. Okay, I'll give you a few seconds. All right, so we can say women wear the kimono in the summer. Simple. Okay, so we had to flip it around quite a bit. Okay, and notice that the agent here is in parentheses, but women wear the kimono in the summer would be the active version. Then on page 48 again, the lanterns are lit by families. Again, the lanterns are lit by families. That is passive. The lanterns is the subject now. Then we have the verb, the form of to be, and we have the past participle lit, and then we have the agent by families. So we can make this active. And when we switch sentences between active and passive, that doesn't mean you have to include every single word. In this case, we can say families light the lanterns. Easy. Families light the lanterns. We wouldn't say families lit the lanterns because when we use passive, we use the past participle, so we should switch it to the present. Okay, then we have modal passive. Modal is like the word should, could, would, must. So the stalls must be built by the merchants. Okay, versus an active example would be the merchants must build the stalls. Okay, then the next example says the dead should not be forgotten by the relatives. Okay, you can say the relatives should not forget the dead. That would be active. So it should be very easy for you to switch between active and passive. Now, why in the world do we need to know about passive and active, and why do we need to switch between them? Why do we need to use passive in the first place? All right, so let's look at some examples, do it ourselves, and then we'll move on to learning more about why we should actually use passive. So let's do some practice, and then we'll go on to learning about why. Okay, so we're now on page 49 looking at exercise 1. We will not do all of the questions. We'll only do 3 of them. So we are rewriting these active sentences as passive sentences. And follow along with me for numbers 2 through 4. But 5 through 6, you should do it without writing it down. You should be able to quickly do it in your mind, and that'll show or prove to yourself that you actually understand the passive form. So number 2 says the Japanese celebrate Obon in the summer. Take a moment. Okay, so we know that the object is Obon in the summer. So now Obon in the summer, or at least Obon, needs to become the subject. Okay, we need to take the verb celebrate and we need to add the form of to be, in this case, would be is, and we need to make celebrate a past participle. Simply, in this case, it's just celebrated. And then we have to add the word by, and we have to put the agent where it needs to go. So in my example, I wrote, Obon is celebrated by the Japanese in the summer. Or you could say, Obon is celebrated in the summer by the Japanese. Okay, you can say it that way. You could also say, in the summer, Obon is celebrated by the Japanese. It's the same form, still passive. Number 3 says, the stalls protect the fragrant fruit from the sun. Some alliteration there. Fragrant fruit from. Okay, take a moment. Okay, so you can say the fragrant fruit from the sun is protected by the stalls. Okay, it wouldn't make sense to take out from the sun in this way. The fragrant fruit is protected by the stalls from the sun. You might be risking a misplaced modifier in that case, so it's better to say the fragrant fruit from the sun is protected by the stalls. All right, let's do number 4. The relatives of the dead must guard the grave. Take a moment. Quite simply, the grave, which was the object. Now we need to use modal. We need to use a modal passive. So in the active sentence, we used must. Now in order to make this passive, we have to add be. In this case, we're not conjugating to be. It's just be. You can't say must is or must were. No, you can't do that. So you just take the word be and add it. Okay, so the grave must be guarded by the relatives. Again, the grave must be guarded by the relatives. I do encourage you to do 5 and 6 on your own. In the next slide, we're going to talk about why we use passives in the first place. And we're also going to talk about when the agent can be taken out, omitted. We're going to continue on page 49 quite briefly. Again, what is meant by agent? Again, the agent was the subject of the active sentence. But once we make it passive, the subject becomes the agent and the object becomes the subject. So literally, a passive sentence is a flipped version of active. All right, so if you look at page 49 at the bottom, it says passives without an agent. Okay, so remember we use the passive form when we want to emphasize a process or a result, or the case we don't want to give responsibility to the subject. Let me give you an example of that. I locked the door. I'm taking responsibility for locking the door. Versus the door was locked. Well, in that case, maybe, think about a kid giving an alibi or an excuse to his or her parents. I locked the door, taking responsibility versus the door was locked. Well, let's say this child does not want to take responsibility for locking the door, maybe locking his parents out or her parents out, or the child does not know who did it. Okay, so that's sometimes why we use passives. We also can use passives if we don't know, like I just said. So taking away the responsibility, we don't know who did it or what did it or what happened, or we want to emphasize a process or result. Okay, so moving on, sometimes we can use passives without the agent. So we have an example here. We can take it out if it's obvious or not important. It's not essential. So coffee is grown in Colombia. We could say Colombia grows coffee, which is fine. In this case, I guess you could say there is an agent, but there's really not. It's just a prepositional phrase in Colombia. And it's obvious. Coffee is grown in Colombia. There's not much else we need to say. Versus if we said the book was written by. Well, first of all, that's an incomplete sentence, but you would need to have an agent. The book was written by who? Okay. The second example, the agent is not known. Again, one of the reasons that we use passive in the first place. A priceless work was stolen from the city museum yesterday. Okay. Hopefully you notice when I say there's no agent, hopefully you notice that there's no preposition by. Okay, so if that wasn't obvious, let me go back. So there's no agent in these sentences because you don't see the preposition by, which you were just told that that's what you need to use in a passive sentence. But in these cases, you can take that part out. So coffee is grown in Colombia. We didn't say coffee is grown by Colombia. That doesn't really make too much sense. Coffee is grown in Colombia. Okay. If we needed to, we could say by farmers, but I think it's pretty obvious that farmers grow the coffee anywhere, right? That's what we're talking about. In this case, a priceless artwork was stolen. I don't know who stole it. If they did, maybe, this wouldn't be a big deal. So there's no by. The third example says the writer wants to avoid saying who is responsible for an action. Again, another reason that we use passive. Okay, take away the responsibility. The example, like the door was locked. We don't know. The door was locked by someone. Well, I would hope so, or unless it's a ghost or something else. The door was locked, right? In this case, on page 49, it says the news story was leaked to the press over the weekend. We don't know by who, so there's no by. There's no agent. The agent is a general noun. It's a person. Excuse me if it sounds like my head is going back and forth or the audio cuts. It's because I'm actually looking at the book. Anyway, the agent is a general noun. It's a person, people, or pronoun. It's like someone, we, one, you, or they. So the example that I used about the door was locked. The door was locked by someone. It's not essential for me to say by someone or something. That's obvious, right? So we don't need to put that information. Turkey is eaten by Turkey is eaten at Thanksgiving. Turkey is eaten at Thanksgiving by people. Really? Of course. So we don't need to mention that. So turkey is eaten at Thanksgiving. Works perfectly fine. At the bottom, it says, be sure to use an agent when it is important. That should be obvious. Again, I gave you the example about a book. The book was written by. Okay? We need the information. We need the agent. In this case, Romeo and Juliet was written by Shakespeare. If we've taken out the agent here, Romeo and Juliet was written. Yes, of course, yes, absolutely. We know this, but we need to put the agent by who? By Shakespeare. So this is what we mean by passives without agent. There is no preposition by, and there's no agent that follows it. And only for these reasons should you not use by in a passive sentence structure. All right, so now we're going to keep going to page 50. Again, we're not going to do all of the exercise. Of course, I encourage you to do it on your own. Let's look at exercise 2 on page 50. So number 1 is done for you. Number 2 says everyone should pick up litter and trash. Okay. So again, we are omitting the agents. So you're not going to have a by. Take a moment. Okay, so you should have written litter and trash must be picked up. We don't need to say by everyone. That should be obvious. It should be picked up, okay? Everyone should do their part. So litter and trash must be picked up. That's the answer for number 2. Looking at number 3, it says parents must not allow children to play with fireworks. Take a moment. Okay, so you should have written children must not be allowed to play with fireworks. Okay. Children must not be allowed to play with fireworks. Why didn't we put by parents? Well, we assume that parents would be the ones to tell them not to do that. Teachers or other outside people probably wouldn't tell them to do that because your teacher is not going to be around you when you're using fireworks. That's non-school time, so we can assume that would be parents. And in any case, I think it should be obvious that children should not be allowed to play with fireworks, so we don't need the agent in that case. Okay, and so on and so forth. Now let's quickly go down to exercise 3. It asks you to include or omit agents with passives. So change the following active sentences to passive and omit the agent when it is not necessary. Okay, so in some cases you'll have to determine if it's necessary or not. Now let's use number 1 as an example. People eat sushi in Japan. I'll let you have a moment to think about that. So I would say sushi is eaten in Japan. Okay? I wouldn't say sushi is eaten in Japan by Japanese people. That's repetitive. Okay? And it's also not the point because people all over the world eat sushi. But in this case, we want to emphasize that sushi is obviously a part of Japanese cuisine. In this case, we don't need an agent. Sushi is eaten in Japan. It would be unnecessary to add by. Okay, we don't need an agent as well. Okay, let's look at number 2. The city government organizes many festivals. Take a moment. This is an example of a situation in which you would probably want to use the agent. So let's see. So many festivals are organized by the city government. So why do we need the agent? If you just said many festivals are organized, well, yeah, they are, but in that case, festivals can be organized maybe through an organization. Usually festivals aren't organized by individual people, but could be a group of people, or it could be a nonprofit organization or something like that. In this case, it's a little ambiguous, and in that case, it might be best to just go ahead and put the agent and say that many festivals are organized by the city government. Excuse me, if I said city governments, I didn't mean to say that. Sorry, many festivals are organized by the city government, which is even more of a reason to go ahead and add the agent, because the means that we are specifically talking about a certain city government. All right, so in that case, that completes exercises 2 and 3. If you would like to continue with 3, go ahead and do that. For your first draft, of course, I have to always go back to talk about that because this is the reason that we're talking about it. Make sure you check to be very certain that you used your passive sentences correctly. Let's say you did use passive sentences, but you didn't put the agent when it actually should be mentioned in there. Well, you need to revise that, because if I'm looking at your essay or anyone's looking at your essay, I might say, by who? Or, I don't understand your sentence, it's unclear. A lot of times if I say unclear sentences, there's something that is usually missing. Okay, so make sure you go back to your draft and double check that your passives are indeed correct and specific where it needs to be. The next slide, we will talk about when you cannot use passives because of the intransitive verb. We'll do some quick practice with that. Then the last part will be editing a paragraph. It's very simple, and you'll continue to edit the work as needed. And that'll be it for the grammar focus and language focus for this particular essay. Before we continue, let me clarify the points from the previous slide, also for me to avoid re-recording the whole thing. On page 49, I expressed to you the 1, 2, the third example, and I said for the writer, the news story was leaked to the press over the weekend, and I said in the previous slide that we don't know who. Sorry, in this case, I need to emphasize that the writer wants to avoid saying who's responsible. So that goes back to one of the reasons that we use passive, is to take away or avoid responsibility. So it's not that it's not known, it's just taking away responsibility. So correction to that. The news story was leaked to the press over the weekend. In this case, the writer does not want to give responsibility to a specific person or agent, and that's the reason why we may use a passive without an agent. Okay, and also to clarify the point about the book was written, I shouldn't have said the book was written by. I should have just gave you the example of the book was written. If you use that, the book was written, you need an agent in that case. The book was written by obviously is an incomplete sentence, so we wouldn't even include by, sorry. So the book was written needs an agent, because why are you telling me that the book was written? If it's a book, then of course it was written by who, okay, or by what? Usually it's a who, but maybe a collection of people in an organization wrote this particular piece. So those are just the points I wanted to clarify on page 49. So my apologies if you were confused by that. Okay, so now let's continue and talk about when we cannot use passive because the verb is intransitive. Remember that an intransitive verb does not have an object. So we can't make it passive in that case. So looking at the example of the language focus, it says verbs with no passive form. So intransitive verbs are not followed by an object and do not have a passive form. You can't have a passive form if you can't even have any type of agent. Now, this is different than what we just talked about, omitting the agent for certain reasons. That means that there's still an agent, we just don't have to write it down. In this case, there is no agent, so you can't make it passive, okay? So this is only with intransitive verbs. Some examples of intransitive verbs are listed there, like arrive and come, and then be itself, the verb, to be, took or sit or struggle, and those are just some examples. We also have some transitive verbs that do not have passive forms because it would be awkward to write it that way. So become, cost, fit, have, resemble. So let's quickly do the exercise 4. It says, change the sentences to the passive form. Now, if the verb in the sentence does not have a passive form, write X next to the sentence. Okay, so number 1, we're only going to do 2 of these, and I'll explain them. Number 1 says, the special costume fits Kaoru perfectly. We'll pause here. Okay, so if you follow what's in the gray box exactly, then you would have figured it out because it's right there for you. But it should be obvious anyway, because obviously you're not going to have a word bank when you're writing all the time. It says the special costume fits Kaoru perfectly. Well, there's no passive form. If you reverse the sentence to put Kaoru as the subject in the beginning, Kaoru fits the special costume perfectly. And it doesn't matter about where to put the adverb. Sometimes we put it at the end, sometimes we put it before the verb that it's modifying. So Kaoru perfectly fits the costume. That's still grammatically correct. But that's not passive. All you did was switch the sentence around so that the subject is at the forefront of the sentence. That does not make it passive. There is no form of to be plus a past participle or any kind of agent. This is just flipping the sentence. So that is an example of when a passive would not be acceptable. If you try to put that in passive form, you would end up speaking like Yoda. Okay, you would sound like you're speaking backwards in English, so that wouldn't work. Okay, let's look at number 2. Oh, actually, let me give you an example of number 1. So if you said, Kaoru is fitted by the special costume perfectly. That sounds funny. And if you have an ear for the English language, you would know that should sound awkward. Kaoru is fitted by the special costume perfectly. You sound like Yoda. You're speaking backwards, okay? Doesn't sound right. Okay, number 2. The families bless the gifts offered to the spirits. Okay, let's pause there. Okay, a number of things, yes, I used that word things, could have happened in your sentences here. This is a sentence that could be put in passive. Now, if you're not understanding the passive form, you may have written it without taking out some of the words. Like maybe you said, to the spirits, families bless the gifts. Like that, no, that's not correct. Again, it sounds like you're speaking backwards, like Yoda, and then that's not correct. Some of you may have said the spirits are blessed by the family with gifts. You could say that, kind of like the Japanese Obon example we used earlier, but in this case, it's like you're misplacing the modifier. So it sounds okay, but really it's not. You should put the direct object after the verb. So it's better to say the spirits are blessed with what? With gifts by the families. So when you're writing passive, don't mix up your agents and prepositional phrases and extra information. These sentences are pretty straightforward. Imagine if you were writing a much longer sentence, you could possibly mix up everything and make it sound awkward. Passive is not meant to be awkward. We're flipping the sentence, but we're not speaking backwards. So again, the spirits are blessed with what? With gifts. Put the direct object after the verb, blessed, by the families. By the families, that is the agent. Instead of by the families with gifts, that's not the full agent. So by the families is the agent. Again, your answer for number 2, the spirits are blessed with gifts by the family. So hopefully that's pretty clear. Let's move on to the last activity. I'm pretty sure you're excited. Page 52, editing a paragraph, exercise 5. So I'm going to read the paragraph to you exactly as it is and do a very short pause after each sentence. You should be able to quickly hear what's wrong. Okay, so remember the structure that we talked about, the form of the verb to be plus the past participle. Okay, so just remember that point. It says there are 7 mistakes, so you need to look out for 7 of them. You can correct them as you go, or you can circle where you know there's an error. Let's get started. Every year, the falling autumn leaves signal the approach of Halloween. It is one of the most popular holidays in the United States, and it enjoyed by both children and adults. Many parties are held on this occasion when special costumes, masks, and wigs worn. Some of the most popular costumes that are chosen are characters from children's fairy tales as well as witches, ghosts, and famous movie stars. Prizes are often given for the most unusual and creative disguises. Faces are painted with odd designs and colorful makeup. The fronts of many houses decorated with gravestones, monsters, and jack-o'-lanterns. These lanterns are making from pumpkins, which are carved out to create scary faces. On the night of Halloween, children go trick-or-treating, which means going from house to house to collect candy. For kids and adults alike, Halloween is great fun. But remember, young children should to be accompanied by an adult at all times. Okay, so let's go back through it. If you need to pause, then just go ahead and pause the audio here, if you can. All right, so the first mistake is in the second sentence. It is enjoyed by children and adults. Okay, it enjoyed is not correct. It is enjoyed. Okay, the second mistake. Many parties are held on this occasion when special costumes, masks, and wigs are worn. Are worn. Okay, the next one is in the next sentence. Some of the most popular costumes that are chosen, not are chose. We have to put it in the past participle form. Are chosen. Are chosen. The next error, faces are painted with odd designs. Faces are painted with odd designs. The next one, the fronts of many houses are decorated with gravestones. The fronts of many houses are decorated with gravestones, are decorated. Okay, the next one, these lanterns are making, no, these lanterns are made from pumpkins. These lanterns are made from pumpkins. We can't say mate, it's not correct. Are made. Okay, the last one, I kind of gave you a clue because naturally I read it correctly. But remember, don't use fanboys at the beginning of the sentences. It doesn't look good. Anyway, but remember, young children should be, not should to be. Okay, because this is passive, we can't use the infinitive. We can't use to. So should be. Nothing goes between the modal should and be. Okay, the only thing that could go in between that would be like not. So again, young children should be accompanied by an adult at all times. So that's it for that section, and that's it for everything. What do you need to do for your drafts? Again, go through and check to make sure that you wrote the correct past participles. And did you put the verb? Okay, because sometimes this happens in your writing as well. And it enjoyed, for example, you might have just forgot the verb. All right, maybe you're writing passive and you didn't even know you're writing passive. Well, now you know. And you have to put the verb in this case. Or maybe you use the wrong past participle. There's no special rules about past participles in English. There's none. So if you don't know all of the past participles, which, okay, granted, some native speakers don't know as well, but you should go online and review and find a resource for a list of past participles and become familiar with those. Okay, great. So at this point, we are finished with the editing process. Woohoo! So the next step that you should do, if you would like extra practice on any of this, you can go to pages 53 and 54. Let's see, I think there's another page. Yep, and 55. So if you need more practice, you can go to pages 53 through 55 and practice. If you'd like to practice your overall essay structure form, you can go to pages 56 through 57. If you turn to page 58, there's an editor's checklist. There's certain grammar that I have not required on your according to your rubric, so I'm not going to say, you know, I'm taking off 2 points if you didn't use time clauses, but I'm telling you that that is something that should be used. And if you want a better grade and also to improve as a writer, I would highly recommend taking the advice of the book. Okay, so you should be looking at a lot of aspects. You should be looking at your spelling mistakes, your mechanical mistakes, which also includes spelling, of course, and punctuation. You should be looking at your sentence structure. Have you varied your sentence structure? Are you using time clauses correctly? Are you using the passive tense at all? And if you are, which you should be, are you using that correctly? Verb consistency, everything that we've looked at. It's a process. And then once you get that out of the way, spelling and mechanics, it's the little stuff, right? Look at that first. Then go into your sentence structure. So you're literally looking at every sentence. And then you need to focus on the big picture. Now you're looking at, is your paragraph, or excuse me, are your paragraphs cohesive? Do they relate back to the topic sentences? Do you need to add more information? Do you need to explain some of the information that you've mentioned in those body paragraphs? And then, of course, introduction and conclusion are their own forms of paragraphs. You already know the format for those, so make sure that those paragraphs fit that format. Like introduction has the hook, the background, and your thesis. The conclusion has the restatement of your thesis, and you can give an evaluation, a warning, a recommendation, certain things like that. Okay, so that's everything. Again, remember that your second draft will be due on Moodle when? March 22nd, and that is a Sunday, and it's due by midnight. The portal will be opened, or should be opened, as of Saturday, March 21st by 7 a.m. So I discourage you from just listening to this lesson and then saying, okay, I'm finished, or maybe you already finished your draft. Great, you need to go back and edit as much as possible, because I'm definitely going to consider that towards your final grade. I'm not going to sit there and make a bunch of little corrections. So if you don't get it right in your second draft, if you don't catch it later on your own, then when you give me the final draft, I'm going to take off a lot of points. I don't expect a lot of these mistakes to be in your final draft. So really take your time with it. This is your only assignment. You're uploading your first draft to Moodle. There are no Google Drive assignments due at this time. Again, there are no Google Drive assignments due at this time. So don't even ask. Don't worry about it. You need to upload it to Moodle. Everyone has a Moodle account. You should be able to log in through your Zagile. All right, again, if you have specific questions about any of the topics discussed in these lessons, please let me know on Facebook, on the Facebook posts themselves. Please do not message me personally with those kind of questions, so that everyone can benefit from them. If you have questions about what we're doing, I'm putting all the information on Facebook. Ask a classmate first. Go through the Facebook posts. Read. Sorry, you have to read the information. All right. Good luck, everybody, and I hope you stay safe and well. Take care.